Why don't we start with JobKeeper and this $60 billion blunder? What was your reaction when you first read about this?
Well, I do have a concern that the government didn't notice the error. They should have been looking at their modelling, which they had done, and noticed a fairly substantial difference. And indeed, if there wasn't a difference, and we must remember that the modelling has not been released, unfortunately, then it might have been the case that the government went into JobKeeper with flawed data and they haven't properly made the right mix in terms of people who were eligible for the program.
We had the government, though, saying when the estimates were being made, we were at the peak of the health crisis and the projections in Australia were a lot worse, that the infection rate was 29%, for example, of an increase over 3 days. Obviously, there's been a much better health outcome than we thought. Wouldn't that make sense? As a result, there'd also be a better result in terms of how many people had to go on JobKeeper?
Well, I think we need to ask those people who are about to lose their jobs or have lost their jobs, where we had a program where there could have been scope for making sure that those people didn't lose their jobs. We have to examine exactly what happened in this process.
So, to that very point, one industry right now, we're just seeing the beginning perhaps of the impact of job cuts. Universities, Deakin University announcing there will be losses. What's your reaction to this?
Well, we also saw last week that Central Queensland University is shutting a number of campuses. This is deeply disturbing. This is an area which is not covered by JobKeeper because of the casual nature of many of the universities. This will be a huge problem for Australia because not only do people in universities educate our next generations, they also carry out a lot of research and development work, which is critical for Australia moving forward. If we do not arrest what is happening in the education sector and the university sector, we may well be cutting off our nose in spite of our face.
Is that going to be the hardest thing for the government? On the university sector, they initially argued, well, they've got a lot of money, and plenty of them do, money in the bank to be able to get them out of this. Suddenly this extra potential amount to spend pops up. The government still says no, that people will look at the university sector, however badly it's hit, and say, you could have done more.
I think they could have done more. There is a real risk here that we will lose critical R&D capability at a point in time where we need to be looking at self-sufficiency. We need to be looking at how we spin up and do value add right across our industry. Again, we may well be cutting our nose off in spite of our face. This is a sector which adds considerable value to Australian manufacturing industries.
The other aspect of this, of course, is international students. There's still a big reliance for the universities. That in part is because the government couldn't get through changes a few years ago on increasing fees for domestic students. Would you be open to supporting something like that? It was a big debate for a previous crossbench.
Well, I think that goes in the wrong direction. We must recognise the value that education provides right across the community. We have a whole range of areas where we see massive increases in government spending that almost get ignored. A $10 billion increase in the Future Submarine Project, for example, just over the last few weeks, almost completely ignored. Just imagine what that sort of money could do for the education sector.
So you think the solution is government money? Your party would never support another push for increased domestic fees for universities?
I can't see that. It needs to go in the opposite direction. We need to make sure education is affordable and that we are priming our future industry for the tasks that they have ahead of them.
One of the aspects of COVID-19 people are talking up is more time at home, perhaps less time in the commute. On the flip side, the concern is a potential increase in domestic violence. What are you hearing about this at the moment, the preliminary evidence as to whether this is happening?
Well, look, there's no question that there has been a rise in the incidence of domestic violence. It was a problem before COVID, and in fact, this leads to the awful outcome last week of a Senate inquiry into domestic violence, which ended 3 months early, took no submissions, had no hearings. The Senate committee that was responsible for looking at domestic violence in the wake of the terrible murder of Hannah Clark and her 3 children effectively sold out all Australians. It's a disgrace, and the Senate will need to fix that. Domestic violence is a significant problem. The government has been doing work on domestic violence, and they have provided additional funding throughout COVID, but there are clearly things that are not working, and we need to reach out to the sector, the people that deal with both the perpetrators and the victims of domestic violence, and work out what is and isn't working and what we could do better. And unfortunately, we had a Senate committee last week that's basically sold out victims of domestic violence.
Just finally, a lot of talk about China, including on the Belt and Road Initiative that the Victorian government has signed up to, and now seemingly doesn't want to talk about a lot. Are you pleased to see federal Labor saying they won't go down this path?
Well, the interesting thing is when this MOU was first put in place back in November 2018, that was the point at which I asked the Senate to conduct an inquiry into our relationship with China, and I didn't get Liberal Party support. We have an issue here where it is the federal government that is responsible for international affairs. That's a constitutional responsibility, and we see not just state governments, but universities and other elements of the Australian economy working directly with the Chinese in relation to deals. Now, I have no objection to Chinese investment, but I think it needs to be done in the context of national interest, and that is definitely a federal government responsibility.